and we'll have some eats and maybe wine and cheese and stuff. So I want to encourage you to drop by. It's fairly empty right now. We haven't had the office long enough to stock it. If anyone has extra Holocaust books, journals, anything that's a resource that students or community can use. Or food. Right. I'm sure there'll be plenty of appetites. But anyway, drop by between time, and we're going to try to collect videotapes, audio tapes, anything that can be used as a resource for students and faculty and community in the future. So come by. It would be nice to see you there. Yes. 2 till 4 before class, since class starts at 4. It's Rachel Carson Hall 62. It's just an office. We just had some bookshelves built by our supporter Peter Lowenthal. They have almost nothing on them yet, but we will. Give us time. The other I'd like to announce is I'll be teaching a class called Women in the Holocaust this fall through Extended Ed. For any of those of you who are interested in this subject, it's just a 1-unit class from 7 to 10 on Wednesday evenings. I have it written here. It'll be Women's Studies 311. I don't know the section yet. It'll be A, B, C, F, whatever. So be in touch. It'll be starting a little bit later. It'll be starting September 23rd, since that's the first night I could get a room on campus, and running 6 evenings after that. And depending on what the enrollment is, I'll probably have a limited enrollment of 20 people so that people have time to talk. So I don't want it to get much larger than that. It's a fairly intense subject. And if there's room and you're a community member who would like to attend, see me, and we'll see if we can fit you in. Anybody else have announcements?
Yeah, I guess I've been
Okay.
Over the years that we've these Holocaust lectures, we've tried to improve them every year, and one of the devices we use is a survey form, which we get reactions from the people who've taken part in the lecture series, whether they've been in the class or whether they are coming just for the lectures. I have this form today. I'm going to pass it out. I hope everyone will complete the form because it'll help us in evaluating what we did this year and in making plans for next year. So please complete them.
Before we start the panel, I would like to introduce the third member. You are already well aware of Professor Steiner and myself, but the third member of the panel is Professor Francisco Vazquez. He came to Sonoma State in 1989 and taught for a year in the Mexican American Studies Department. He is now a full-time professor in the Hutchins School. He received his BA from Claremont McKenna in philosophy, and his PhD work was also done at Claremont Graduate School in history. Interests include continuing analyses of cultural and racial relations in the United States. So please welcome, if you will, Professor Francisco Vazquez. The order in which we will proceed today, Professor Steiner first will have an opportunity to develop some sociological perspectives upon the Holocaust, and then he will be followed by Professor Vazquez, and then I will bring up the rear, so to speak, and hopefully there'll be plenty of time left for discussion. So let me turn the mic over to Professor Steiner.
Thank you very much, Robert. Now, I'm not going to speak so much about specifically that, but I'd like to be sure that we will come to terms with the notion of genocide. And because Holocaust is a genocide, it was a genocide. So what we need to do first, before we go into the specifics of genocide and the various types of genocide, I think we need to distinguish between what I see as massacres, revolutions, civil war, uprisings, rioting, and genocide. To complicate matters even further, we have also different kinds of genocide, such as autogenocide, fratricide, and the like, and I'll be going into that a little bit further later on.
To hold the mic closer.
Closer?
Yeah.
Okay. It kind of rings in it, kind of a strange ring in it. So let us look more closely at the meaning of the word genocide as such. Now, genus, a kind, a category of related organisms, usually including several species, also a class or kind of common attributes, attributions. And side, from the Latin cedere, is to kill. From a more sociological perspective, we can say that genocide is planned annihilation of a racial, political, ethnic, religious, social class or cultural group, usually, but not always, a minority.
Yeah, okay.
This planned annihilation is most frequently carried out by a state minority, that is to say, a power elite, and may or may not have the tacit, overt or covert support of the masses. Genocide usually occurs during war, civil war, and political, social, and economic. These are the times where this most frequently emerges, genocide, that is. The basis for genocide is to be found in an absolutist or absolutist ideologies which are permeated with prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, racism, and negative attributions. And I'm particularly specifying in negatives, not positive. The justification for genocide is therefore ideologically substantiated, that is on a belief, is posited on a belief or myth system. This justification on such an absolutist ideology enables the perpetrators, those who commit genocide, to dehumanize their victims so that killing them will not be experienced as immoral. The stripping them of their humanity makes the killing of the victims acceptable. It makes it okay. People who are not viewed on the same level with the perpetrators, that is to say, level of worth, if you will, can be subjected to differential treatment. In short, it makes it politically and morally acceptable to exterminate the so designated because they are depicted as parasites, vermin, as elements of decomposition unworthy of living, and hence subject to destruction. And that is something which, in my research of perpetrators, I found always the case. They just play very many roles, and these roles they play, we all play a number of roles, a set of roles. And one of these roles, of course, in terms of their occupation, which was, let's say, members of the SS or KGB or the like, or secret police, to kill their opponents makes it okay simply because they are not placed or viewed and placed on the same level as they are, and therefore they justify by way of saying, I'm doing it in the interest and betterment of the society. And therefore morally they can go to bed and do all the normal things which other people do and not feel disturbed about it. And that's precisely the type of psychological self-justification which does make them to come into conflict with themselves, with their conscience. So we can distinguish societies which are potentially non-genocidal and those which are genocidal by looking at their dominant historical trends and tendency. The way also they resolve conflict, with what sort of means do they resolve conflict, with violent means or non-violent means, and that makes, of course, a decisive difference. In genocidal societies, we can observe differential treatment of peoples, their stereotyping, discrimination and violence on a large scale. Thus we can determine the nature of a given society. So, for example, in the United States we have had the decimation of American Indians, we have had slavery, we have had racism, anti-Semitism, and during World War II, dispossession and internment of Japanese Americans. This gives us some idea whether or not we as a society are a potentially genocidal society. Now let me talk about more specifics in terms of the of genocidal societies, which we can get from Louis Irving Horowitz, a sociologist who has been one of the first to really research genocide in an in-depth sort of fashion, and has been exceedingly helpful in clarifying some of the things which somewhat complicated and not at all frequently discussed. Systems provide a continuum, as we understand. It is only when one examines the pole of this continuum that the extent of differences in human organizations become apparent. Beyond that, we are faced with the grim truth that any given nation may exhibit 8 types, and he refers to very specifically 8 types of patterns over a sufficient length of time, types of genocidal societies. Much depends on the primary and secondary definition of a society rather than the existence of any one type and the absence of all other types. So he lists as the first type of genocidal society, the society in which the state arbitrarily takes the lives of citizens for deviant or dissident behavior. Since this work is dedicated to a full exploration of object, an extent definition is not required, he says. But it must be emphasized that the gap between genocidal and all other types of societies is qualitative. It is the only form of rule which takes lives systematically. So that was the genocidal societies, the types of genocide. Second, deportation or incarceration societies, in which the state either removes individuals from the larger body politic or form prevents the interaction with the commonwealth in general. That was the second, the deportation or incarceration societies. Third, torture societies in which people are victimized short of death, returned to the societies from which they emanated, and left in these societies as living evidence of the high risk of deviance or dissidence. So these were the torture societies. Fourth, harassment societies in which deviants are constantly being picked up, searched, seized, or held in violation of laws that are usually remote from the actual crimes the state feels these individuals have committed. Since laws can be invoked against almost any behavior, the possibility of harassment of individuals through legal channels is infinite. These 4 types of societies have in common the physical and the dislocation of deviant dissident individuals, employing everything from simple harassment for non-payment of taxes, for example, to direct liquidation of the person. What is involved is physical. There are 4 other types of society, socialist systems, that use what might be called the symbolic method for gaining allegiance and adherence. These are traditional shame societies, societies where participation in the collective will is generated through instilling the individual with a sense of disapproval from outside sources and ensured by the isolation suffered as a result of non-participation in the normative system. Six, the guilt societies, closely akin to shame societies, but which internalize a sense of wrongdoing in the individual cause to respond to normative standards. Seventh, tolerant societies where norms are well articulated and understood, but where deviance and dissidence are permitted to go unpunished. They are not celebrated but not destroyed either. These can be described as a series of pluralisms operating with a larger monism. 8. Permissive societies in which norms are questioned community definitions rather than state definitions of what constitutes normative behavior emerge in the decision-making process. But finally, while at least the last 7 of these 8 types of societies overlap, they are distinct enough to merit differentiation and understanding on their own terms. Each of these 8 types of societies can be found in capitalist, socialist, or any kind of society, whatever its nature, and it would be gratuitous to claim that the movement from capitalism to socialism requires or involves a movement from less punitive to more permissive or less permissive to more punitive societies. To attempt such correlation at this level is a snare and delusion inviting spurious sorts of measures and variables. Now finally, capitalism and socialism are not strictly economic systems, they yield of mixed political and ideological persuasions. Thus, if we isolate but one item, the number of parties operating in a given system, we find a similar lack of correlation between types of polity and forms of rule. While it would appear to be the case that single-party states reveal higher levels of coercion than multi-party states, the single-party apparatus of Mexico or Israel, for example, with all due tolerance for the formal existence of smaller satellitic parties in these 2 nations, may operate more democratically than multi-party apparatus in Argentina or Indonesia. In any event, the purpose of our discussion is not to examine the relationship between the democratic process and political parties, rather it's to develop first a typology. And that is what Irving Horowitz has distinguished in the types of the potentially genocidal societies. Now, so to make it perfectly clear and simple, a definition of genocide can be done as follows. And we can say as a structural and systematic destruction of innocent people by a state bureaucratic apparatus. I said already, ideology, propaganda is used by the power elite to assure support, conformity and participation by the citizenry. Without such support, genocide would not be possible. So that is very important for us, that we develop a degree of sensitivity in terms of the writing on the wall. To what extent have we developed into a genocidal society where indeed an escalation of violence is possible due to ideological reasons and situational conditions which prevail in time and space. So we need to be vigilant, and we need to be able to define and read the prevailing and dominant situation in time and space, which either can make an escalated genocide possible or will retard it. And we have to play as citizens our part to prevent it by understanding what can develop and what should be stopped in time. Furthermore, a special type of genocide practice is employed against overseas rather than native population. The 19th century European imperialists systematically destroyed communities outside their mother country. Decimation of, for example, Zulu tribesmen by British troops, the Dutch-run slave trade, and the virtual depopulation of the Congo by Belgians typify this form of colonial genocide. And a third type of so-called auto-genocide took place in China, where people in power, the Khmer Rouge, exterminated in a rather arbitrary and random fashion those who were of the same kind but may have worn glasses, for example, as I'm doing now, or looked intellectual, as I may not. had a decimation, which in this case auto-genocide in Cambodia, of about 1 million people. And not much we have cared about that because they are too distant. We don't relate to them because they are so different. And that's precisely one of the problems, that in this sort of global and closer interaction which takes place in today's world, we tend to relate more closely to those people, us, and less to those who are different. And therefore, whatever happens there is their problem and not ours. Now, hopefully, the United Nations will make a difference, provided that they will play their part. And I'm a little bit skeptical. We have some people here, friends and colleagues, who are a little bit more optimistic than I may be. However, we need to remember that those engaging in genocide nearly always define the people to be purged, decimated, or exterminated as alien or enemy population, whether this is based on facts or not. Here again, Japanese Americans are a case in point, especially if we note that there was no single case of betrayal by Japanese Americans during World War II, but a good number German Americans, for example, who were not interned or discriminated against, were indeed active in spying and sabotaging. And that is a very interesting thing. Why were the Japanese interned and the Germans not? Well, there are some different answers to that question, but I won't go into that. The fact is that their number is very great, that virtually every family or more can find some German ancestry in it. And by the way, just to inform you, those who don't know, almost the fact that you speak English now wouldn't have happened. It almost became German. Our language in this society almost became German or English. It was just, you know, just a little bit of a difference, and most people don't realize that. As Leon Gordon inquired, who made the destruction of the 300,000 or so Indonesian communists after a attended coup d'etat in 1965 a matter for the United Nations? Who saw the deprivation of the rights of Asians in Uganda as an outrage? Still is going on, by the way. Who intervened on behalf of the Armenians who were decimated by the Turks, who were and still are liquidated by our friend Saddam, and the Turks to some extent? Who labeled as genocidal the slaughter of Hutu tribesmen, 80,000 or so of them, by the Tutsi elite of Burundi? How much attention was given to the horrors of civil war in Nigeria or Mozambique? I had, for example, a student some years ago who escaped from a concentration camp in Mozambique. His father was a medical doctor and was murdered by the communists in power, as well as his mother. I nursed him through his stay at this campus. He was an excellent student and was still suffering from a post-traumatic stress syndrome, virtually paranoid that people were still after him. Who has tried to ease the emergence of Angola by protecting the humanity of all involved? Who talks of the operations of the secret political police, whose knock at dawn or night and fog is a common sound in dictatorships of the and the left? Examples are Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, El Salvador, Guatemala, and recently also, as we know, Chile. Now it's changing a little bit. Many other places people have not heard of and therefore do not care or are concerned what happens there. And then, of course, East European countries and the Soviet Union, where about 20 million people were liquidated. Whether people live or die is a fundamental distinction that may enable us to make a science of society a fundamental discipline. Because of viewing genocide scientifically, we need to guard against broadening the concept of genocide so it does not become symbolically all-embracing and hence meaningless. So we need to develop a typology in which categories of destruction will be carefully categorized. To illustrate, there is an entity called cultural genocide which may be as horrible as physical genocide. Or, to put it in a question, are we dealing here with a different phenomenon between cultural genocide and physical genocide? This is not mere for academic disputation. It has to do with survival capacities of entire peoples. According to Irving Horowitz, genocide means the physical dismemberment and liquidation of people on large scales, an attempt by those who rule to achieve the total elimination of a subject people. Genocide does not mean simply depriving people of their cultural heritage, and it does not mean deprivation of opportunities for education, welfare, or health of a segment of the population, however hideous such deprivation might be. Broadening the concept so that everyone somehow ends up a victim of genocide only leads to a tautological. Same thing will find the broadening of the definition of survivor. We've had lots of people who they are survivors, and that of course is at times confused with survivors of concentration camps. There are different types of survivors, but the notion which is used as survivor is usually attached to a survivor of concentration or destruction camps. And when we just simply mix up all these definitions and just everyone is now a survivor and a victim of some sort of genocidal activity, then I think we're going to have a mess of a definition and certainly will lack accuracy in terms of what it stands for. Physical genocide is monumentally catastrophic as it is, in just raw numerical terms, not to require a vision of symbolic genocide. To enable the powerful to succeed in realizing genocide, a broad tacit support of a given population is a prerequisite. If, on the other hand, a given population does not render the necessary support, genocide cannot become a reality, particularly when we think into the in terms of how people in Denmark and Finland, we have not really discussed Finland very much because they were fighting with the Nazis, with the Germans against the Soviet Union. But when they were asked to hand out to the Germans their Jewish citizens, they absolutely refused. And not a single Finnish Jew was sent to the Nazi concentration camps. All right, so this is just in a nutshell what I thought I might relate to you, and if there are going to be any questions, I'll be happy to respond to them.
I was thinking just to put this book on the board.
There was a question, John.
Let's wait until later on when we have a question and answer period, if that is okay, so that we have it all at once. Okay?
That's
Right.
fine.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate. And what I have done is really thought about the subject and put some thoughts that I can share from my own particular perspective. The questions that I formulated when given the topic comparative genocide are two. Number one, what sort of power-knowledge relations lead to the physical or psychic destruction of certain peoples? And number two, under what conditions are human beings categorized in such a way that their bodies become targets of dehumanizing practices? Listening to Professor Steiner, I think we're probably going to disagree a lot, but probably not. What I'm concerned with is really the decimation or the extermination of human bodies per se. Most of my studies that I've done with the kinds of power relations that lead to that kind of effect. And so one proposition that I drew from my two questions is, under certain relations of production or desire, a certain worth, a certain utility is attached to the human body. And what I have done, it's going to be difficult talking here, but what I have done is what I call the production of desire, or the relations of production of desire, is that for any kind of example in history that you find, you have someone who has a particular objective, a particular goal in mind. You have the position of speaker, those who speak, who have the authority to get anything done. You have concepts or conceptual schemes or philosophy, whatever you want to call them, to back their goals, and then they have institutions to back up everything that they're doing. I'm sorry, I had to get up. Can you all hear me? This will be real quick. Is that when you have a particular objective, you have a particular speaker that speaks with authority, with power, you have a conceptual scheme, and then you have institutions. So in the example of Nazi Germany, they have all of this. They had all of these things. In the example of the conquest of Mexico that Professor spoke about, there were particular goals in mind. In the case of Native Americans, Professor Castillo spoke about that. The goals being those of the English Americans, in Mexico being the Spaniards. In the Gulf War, you can do a similar analysis. The American dream, I'll go into that, and one, the China's invasion of Tibet. The situation the way that I look at it is that no matter what's here, what the philosophies or the institutions or whatever, when you look at history, there's always a human body standing at the other side of all of these actions, which is receiving the impact of all of these philosophies. So when people say, well, who has the truth? I usually say, just look at what happened to the human bodies. And that's when you're going to find the truth. So that's what I mean by relations of production, desire. So an example that I just saw on television yesterday is in Somalia, in Africa, where thousands of human beings are being killed by starvation. Yet we do not feel the same compulsion to send 500,000 troops to save their lives as, say, when Kuwaiti lives were threatened. But then people from Somalia do not have millions of dollars in Western banks. Of course, this situation is much more complicated. There are very diverse relations of productions of desire. I already talked about Professor Castillo noting that the Spaniards did not engage in conscious genocide because they needed labor. But then there's the extreme case of Jim Jones, who arranged for his own followers to die in a mass suicide event. There's also evidence that some Indians in Mexico committed mass suicide rather than be subjected to slavery. Some Mexican Indian women killed a newborn for the same reason. It seems that when there is a particular desire to be fulfilled, the worth of human bodies becomes relative to the attainment of such desire. Thus, the Spanish Inquisition tortured and killed many people in order to save them. American soldiers destroyed villages and villagers in Vietnam in order to save them from communism. The God of the Old Testament enabled Samson to decimate the enemies of Israel. Stalin is responsible for millions of dead bodies in order to modernize the Soviet Union, and so on, and so on, and so on. Another proposition, before continuing this discussion of the relations of production of desire, it is necessary to go beyond the ethnic or national categories and focus on the historical practice of the elimination of certain human bodies. Otherwise, we confuse racism or ethnocentrism with relations of power. Under this confusion, it is easy to ignore either gender practices or simply the elimination of certain human bodies because they do not fit into a particular category that is supposed to elicit our concern. For example,
In the pursuit of a particular version of the American dream, namely the pursuit of happiness throughout the unregulated accumulation of capital, we have developed an underclass which is capable of exploding at any moment, as we have seen in the past few weeks. But it is not just a racial question. According to the Senate Judiciary Committee report of March of last year, the United States is, quote, the most violent and self-destructive nation on earth, unquote. The murder rate in the U.S. was more than twice that of Northern Ireland, which is thrown by civil war, 4 times that of Italy, 9 times that of England, and 11 times Japan's. Violence against women is even more pervasive. The rape rate is 8 times higher than in France, 15 times higher than in England, 23 times higher than in Italy, and 26 times higher than in Japan. More than 1.8 million Americans were murdered, raped, robbed, or assaulted in 1990. Another category is that of children. A study by the Food Research and Action Center of March 1981 indicates that 1 in 4 American children suffers from. Some 5.5 million children under age 12 are hungry, and another 6 million are at risk. The other side of this picture of violence against human bodies is the imprisonment of human bodies. California has over 100,000 human bodies behind bars. That is 42,000 more than there are in New York prisons. It is 40,000 more than in all federal penitentiaries combined. It is in any country in the Western world besides the U.S. By 1996, the state prison population will grow to 173,000 in California. In the powerful, sobering movie American Me, Edward James Olmos has made a valiant effort to show the process by which Chicanos, Latinos make up almost half of the 100,000 prison population in California. We read 1/4 of the population. He calls it a culture that eats its own. Contrary to popular notions, what keeps Latinos overrepresented in the prisons and underrepresented in the universities is not their language nor their culture. John Ogbu and Maria Eugenia Matute Bianchi claim that beyond language and culture is what they term the caste-like status of African, Mexican, and Native American ethnic minorities. In short, caste-like status is defined by relations of power which construct these peoples as less worthy than others. These researchers found very strong similarities between these American ethnic groups and Koreans who are born and live in Japan and who, as conquered peoples, are worth less than others. The point here is not to surreptitiously get into a discussion of what might be termed cultural genocide with discussion. Castes exist within the same ethnic groups. The point is, rather, that once we categorize people, it is but a short step towards a practice of internal and external dehumanization, and then to the elimination of human bodies. Thus, Mexicans may be caste-like, but once they become successful, they become Hispanic. In Mexico, it is not caste-like to be Mexican, but it is so to be an Indian, but only if you're poor and dark. At the turn of the 19th century, many Latin American intellectuals used the term the sick continent to explain why their countries were not progressing like other countries. As they saw it, the sickness came from the Indians. It was the Indian blood that was blocking the path to progress. Argentina, in fact, exterminated the Indians, yet it has not become a stable country. Close to home, it has been reported class African Americans are re-evaluating their role with respect to the African American underclass. This is happening in Los Angeles. What we have here then are practices of categorization of human beings or human bodies for a variety of reasons. These practices were born, as we know, with the rise of the state as the major institution for the administration of human affairs. Over the years, these practices have evolved into what is called biopower, that is, the targeting of the human body itself as a source of meaning, of desire, of wealth. Within a particular relation of production of desire, this targeting may be for the benefit of the human body under consideration, or it may be for commercial reasons, or in a given moment, it may be for the elimination of not only certain bodies, but whole groups. This brings us to the problem of definitions and categorization. We have not, species, developed a global consciousness, and consequently, when we confront the elimination of human bodies, we refer to specific categories to which we have a particular allegiance. Thus, this is the 1992 Holocaust lectures, and from what I understand, there's at least one person who feels that I should not be here talking about Mexicans because there was only one and only one Jewish Holocaust. Within the framework that I have presented here, and I'm really going out on a limb here, it can be argued that the Jewish people were subjected to genocide attempts not because they were Jewish, but because of their position in the structure of power-knowledge relations. When a particular group wants to be the master race, I'm talking about the Nazis, and it is confronted by a people who occupy high positions in the relations of production or desire, then within this twisted logic, genocide is the answer. This is not a question of utility of the human body, as it was the case for African Americans, which was for the labor force, Native Americans for their land, and Mexicans for their land and their labor force. If, however, the latter ethnic groups became a danger to the ruling race or ruling class, then the systematic elimination of these Americans, I'm talking about the African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans, considered. Such was, in effect, the claim made in the late 60s by several people. While this is a claim I have been unable to corroborate, in some circles it has acquired the status of fact. The Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States government were considering how to deal, this is in the 1960s, they were considering how to deal with a possible race war in the United States, and they came up with one particular contingency plan. Now, it wasn't public policy, it was a contingency plan. These people get paid for doing contingency plans. So they came up with one that they titled King George. The plan included procedures to remove ethnic minorities from the armed forces, put them in concentration camps, kill them, and dispose of their bodies. The point is that human bodies have, more than ever, due to the shift to a post-industrial society, become disposable commodities. National corporations can roam all over the world looking for the cheapest human bodies to use, and when these bodies are too old or too sick, then they can move to another part of the planet to look for more disposable bodies. It seems, however, that when we do become concerned with human bodies, we restrict our concerns to our own ethnic group, gender, age, geographical location, political beliefs, etc. It becomes a process of categorization of human bodies, and along with that categorization comes the assumption that if push comes to shove, some of these categories are disposable. But I do not want to end in a negative tone. There are things that we can do to counteract these dehumanizing processes and practices. The first and most important is that we need to take control of our own everyday life experiences. While society has become differentiated into categories, we need to find ways in which all humans interact in a positive way. In these critical times, dialogue with one another, we need to sing and dance and eat together, and I see you have plans for that already. One such event will take place on Sunday, June 14th at Santa Rosa Junior College outdoor stage area from 11 to 4 p.m. It is a Race Unity Day, a celebration of human diversity. Some of you got flyers, some of you didn't, but there is a table across from the Student Union giving all the information, and I invite you to join us. Thank you.
I would like to attempt a comparison between the Holocaust, which was the genocide of the European Jews during World War II, and what I will call the genocide of Native American Indians in the history of the United States. We've already mentioned several definitions of genocide. I think it's well to keep in mind that probably the most authoritative body, the UN, that we know of today, that is in the sense that it has the agreement on its declaration on genocide, it has the agreement of the great and overwhelming majority of the international community. The UN defined genocide back in 1940, and they essentially provide a legal definition, but I think it's also a moral definition of the meaning of genocide in the contemporary world. The UN says that a genocide is any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group as such. And then they give 5 different acts, which include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to birth within a group, and finally forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Those are the different acts. I think in a general way that if you want a somewhat restricted definition of genocide, a popular definition might be the deliberate mass murder of men, women, and children within a group by a group. Please keep in mind that the definitions vary. And what I want to work on is more the comparison and the contrast of what I will call the genocide of Native Americans with that of the European Jews during World War II. Historians are usually interested not so much in models, they're interested in patterns. And the particular patterns that I will pick up that seem to me to be very similar in a comparison of the two genocides are the following. The decline of legal protection. If you look at the treatment of the Native Americans across a period of about 150 years, in a country that prides itself on its devotion to law and legal protection, the consequences of such an examination are staggering. In 1787, one of the very first documents passed by the newly established government of the United States, passed by Congress, was the Northwest Ordinance, which recognized that the Indians were independent tribes, that is to say, from a legal point of view, independent nations within the United States. And the Northwest Ordinance guaranteed to them their lands and property, and that they shall be taken from them without their consent, and their property, rights, and liberty shall never be invaded or disturbed, and here was the kicker, unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But you're all well aware of the various Indian wars that took place. In fact, in 1787, the Indians were seen as independent groups within the United States with whom the United government had to treat on a fair and equitable basis. Very quickly, the attitude changed. The removal of legal protections from the Indians is clearly connected to the desire of Americans to take over the lands of the Indians. It's very clear that as the American government expanded its territory, it came to face with the terrible fact that the native populations had a valid legal claim to much of the land of what is now the United States. The first president who was willing to bite the bullet, so to speak, was President Andrew Jackson, when he essentially got Congress to pass an Indian Removal Act in 1830. That was a break from the idea of the Northwest Ordinance, that essentially the Indians would have to be dealt with fairly. The Indian Removal Act simply authorized President Jackson to negotiate the removal of Indians from lands in the southeastern part of the United States, notably Georgia and Alabama, to negotiate their removal to lands that would be set aside for them west of the Mississippi. When Jackson tried to negotiate, the Indians did not want to move. And, so military force was used to compel the Indians to move. What's very interesting here is that the Indians who were moved in American history are known as the so-called 5 civilized tribes. And they were the Creeks and the Cherokees and the Choctaws and the Chickasaws and the Seminoles. And they were called civilized tribes because they had made efforts to assimilate into the dominant. They had started to build towns very much like those of the people who had come from Europe. They started to get into trades. There was in particular the famous Cherokee, half Cherokee if you will, Sequoyah, who developed an alphabet, and within a relatively short period of time the Cherokees had become, had the ability to read. And so that the Indians who ironically were picked upon in the first Great Removal Act were tribes who had gone a great way toward assimilation. So what we have step by step is a decline of legal protection, a seizure of property. What happened was when the Indians refused to move, Jackson used, the Indians actually appealed to the Supreme Court, and there was the astonishing decision by Chief Justice John Marshall that the United States had no right to the Indian lands. And Jackson very cold-bloodedly said, well, let John Marshall enforce the law. I'm going to do what I want to do. And essentially the Indians were forced to remove themselves across the Mississippi in what has gone down in American history as the Trail of Tears. Essentially what happened, I don't think there's any dispute about this, that Indians were forced to move lock, stock, and barrel from where they had been living for generations and generations. They were constantly attacked along the route by Americans who saw them as easy prey. It's been estimated that anywhere between 20 and 25% of the Indians died in the forced march into the Oklahoma Territory, which was then called the Indian Territory. There were continual conflicts between the dominant population and the Native Americans. The Indians were constantly offered the choice of war or the ceding of territory. Bit by bit, a reservation system was established, and in fact, we have a total of about 370 reservation treaties that were established by Native Americans, and apparently none were actually upheld or lived up to by the federal government of the United States. That the Indians were constantly, after signing the reservation treaty, were asked to reduce the amount of land that they needed. And in fact, in 1887, the reservation system was undercut by the idea that it prevented Indians from assimilating. So the government said, we'll pass a new act. It was called the Dawes General Allotment Act. And the idea was that each Indian should take a certain part of the reservation as his own private property and learn to live as an assimilated citizen within the general society. Well, this became a way of creating more land for homesteading for the immigrants coming into the United States, because there was leftover land from the reservation. There weren't enough Indians to use up all the land. So the land which was unused became to settlement by homesteaders who were not Indians. So that in fact the General Allotment Act was simply another way to get around the boundaries of the reservations and open up more and more Indian land. Today, the reservation system, it still exists, and if you put all the reservations together, you would have roughly, if they're all contiguous, you would have a state roughly the size of South Dakota. That's in the lower 48 states. So that you can see that over time, the policy of the United States has led to a situation where, in fact, the people who originally had title to the land, for the most part, have been forced into very narrow confines. So, in the decline of legal protection, in the seizure of property, in the racism that accompanied the seizure of property, this is not a well-known part of American history. If you look at the subjects of racism and manifest destiny. I assume that all of you know that manifest destiny was a 19th century doctrine that claimed that by divine will, the United States would spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And what's surprising is if you read the accounts of leading spokesmen of the day who supported manifest destiny, there were constant and repetitious statements to the effect that the Indians were an inferior race who stood in the way of progress and manifest destiny, and therefore the United States should not have any reservation about moving them aside. There were a few Americans, people like Gallatin, who said, what you're saying is nonsense. Keep in mind the 19th century is a century when racial doctrines developed, like those of Gobineau in France, who wrote on the inequality of races. And the 19th century is really the breeding ground, if you will, of in European culture and in Western culture, of the idea that they were superior by virtue of their race, and that in fact they could do what they would with inferior races. So that racism is fully a part of manifest destiny. And the overwhelming leaders of American society in the 19th century subscribed to the idea that Indians were inferior and should not stand in the way of progress. So that in fact you find race as well economics, I think, at the heart of the genocide of Native Americans. We just back up, keep in mind, in Germany, the Nuremberg laws essentially made German Jews a special, well, actually, it essentially stripped them of their rights as citizens of Germany. There was a seizure of property of German Jews. Obviously, great racism against German Jews that helped to rationalize the treatment of people who were described as troublesome and behind conspiracies that aimed at destroying Germany. Let me switch back to the 19th century. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in the 1830s about the condition of the Indians. The Indians were isolated in their own country, and their race only constituted a little colony of troublesome strangers in the midst of a numerous and dominant people, unquote. So that we move simply from decline of legal protection to seizure of property, accompanied by racism, relocation. Obviously, I don't have to go into the Indians, the Native American Indians were constantly being relocated into smaller bits of land. Nobody mentioned or had the foresight to mention the probable consequence of such actions, that in fact, as the amount of land needed to support a particular tribe got smaller and smaller, it was bound to have devastating consequences upon that group of people. And then once the relocation is done, then different forms of murder. All through the history of the United States, if you read it carefully, whether you're talking about militia, whether you're talking about the actions of the official soldiers of the United States, people like Custer, or if you're talking about ordinary citizens, there are constant examples of not only men, Indian men being killed, but women and children too. It was and it seemed to be aimed directly at destroying a particular group. For example, if you know some of the major battles that were fought, Sand Creek, Custer on the Washita destroyed men, women, and children in a band of Cheyenne. Sand Creek was a massacre of men, women, and children led by the militia. Wounded Knee was the last of the Great Destructive Massacre of Sioux in 1890. The Black Hawk War really wasn't a war, if you read about it. It was the destruction of men, women, and children. It was a massacre. In fact, probably Black Hawk was simply moving from one place to another with his whole tribe, and that alarmed the militia, and they gathered together and went out and killed men, women, and children. It's almost a constant refrain. And one further way in which I think the genocides are alike in the 20th and the 19th century is the idea that genocide always seems to be accompanied by war. That in any genocide that I can think of, whether you're talking about the Armenian, the Cambodian, World War II, elsewhere, there is a war. It might be spread out over a long period of time, but war is associated with genocide. It's almost as if war permits excesses, if you will, such excesses as the widespread killing of people, the mass murder of people. Now, there are obvious ways in which the genocides are not alike. I've just given, I hope if you kept count, about 6 areas in which there is great similarity, that the pattern of the development of genocide between the 20th and the 19th century is very similar. Ways in which they're not alike. For example, the time period involved. Obviously, the Holocaust of World War II was completed in roughly 3.5 years. It is striking and startling that so many people could be killed in such a short period of time. I would argue the genocide of the Native Americans was spread out over a much longer period of time. But in definitions of genocide, time is not necessarily involved. Nobody can say how, in order to be a genocide, that it has to be done in 5 years or 10 years or 20 or 30. Time in the definition of genocide, it seems to me, is open-ended. A plan. Was there a plan to destroy the Native Americans? Very clearly, there was a plan in the Holocaust, the Wannsee Conference. We all know it took place in January of 1942. And it remains very clear. The idea was relocation and the final solution to what was called the Jewish question in Europe. Was there a plan in the United States? Well, it seems to me that it wasn't so much a conscious plan. I would say, on the basis of the evidence, that there was always a desire to get the land. That was the chief plan, to alienate most of the land so that it could be developed by the new nation, the United States. And in order to do that, it had to be taken one way or another. And there were various mechanisms that were developed. But it strikes me that unconscious or conscious, certainly somebody like Andrew Jackson, I think he was very conscious about what he was doing. He wanted the southeastern part of the United States, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, that he was willing to do anything that had to be done to accomplish it. Different authorities in the United States, I think, very clearly were, at least in their own period of power, knew clearly what they needed to do. And in that sense, you could talk about a conscious plan. If you're talking about an overall plan of the United States government, no. Okay? But if you're talking about a persistent, over 100 years, a persistent goal of seizing control of most of the land of the United States for the new nation, okay, there it seems to me that the evidence does support such an idea, that there was a constant pressure to get that land. The technology of death, the methods of death are different. They're more primitive. They're not as high-tech. The Nazis used railroads and concentration camps and ovens, and if you want advanced techniques of mass murder. In the United States, there were similarities, it seems to me. If you'll remember the Einsatzgruppen, who went into the Soviet Union, they originally killed by bullet. They just marched people out, had them dig graves, and killed them by bullet. Many of the Indians were killed in conflicts between the citizens of the federal government and the Native Americans, men, women, and children. So that although the technology was different, it seems to me that the consequences and the end result ended up to be the same. It's also clear in my mind that the economic motivation behind the genocide of the Native Americans was the dominant one. Racism was added to it. I think it seemed, I would argue that it was just, that was reversed with regard to the Holocaust, that the racial motivation of Hitler and the Nazis was the dominant. It's true that the Jews had property that was confiscated, but after all, they were a very small percentage of the German population. And I think it's a little bit hard to argue that the economic motive in the Holocaust was the dominant one as opposed to the racial motive. So in terms of contrast, I think that the economic motive in the United States was essentially behind the genocide, and racism was often used as a rationalization to justify what was being done to the native population. There are theories, just let me finish up quickly, there are theories, if you read about the Holocaust, of intentional interpretations versus functional interpretations. And the intentional interpretation, the people who support that explanation argue that the Holocaust was directly planned and carried out by the Nazi government with the results that we know. The functionalists argue that there was in fact no plan, that it was carried out by various bureaucracies and bureaucrats who understood in some vague manner that they were supposed to gather the Jews together and to eliminate them. Well, that doesn't sound to me very convincing. I mean, I've always supported the intentional explanation of the Holocaust. But curiously enough, I think that the functional explanation of what happened to the Native Americans is probably closer to the truth. That is, in the absence of an overall national plan to destroy the Native Americans, what essentially happened were a series of sporadic conflicts that would come up in very similar manner time after time over the land, and that various people, ranging from local political leaders, local militias, simply civilians, went out and essentially accomplished what they saw as needing to be accomplished at that time in connection with the Native Americans. In summary, I would say there are at least 6 good comparisons that can be made between the Holocaust in the 20th century and the genocide of the Native Americans in the 19th century. There are differences, but the overall result over time is that in both countries, I think the people who live in those countries need to address in a serious way the genocide that is connected to their history. I think history is a window to the past, but it can also be a mirror to the present. I would argue that a lot of the problems associated with the genocide of the Native Americans are still very much alive. There are still questions about the land and the reservations. There are still questions about racism, about whether or not Native Americans need to assimilate into American culture, or they should have protection for their own culture. Those questions are still alive. And it's probably up to all of us in various ways, first to recognize that, and then to take actions that hopefully would move us forward. Thank you.
There's one thing which I'd like to respond to you, Bob, about the claim that Jews are a race. Well, this claim cannot be sustained, and it's purely ideological in nature. There is no such thing as a Jewish race, but there is a Jewish religion. And I think we need to set that very clearly, very straight, because otherwise that's exactly what the Nazis wanted us to believe, that there is a Jewish race, but there is no such thing. There is a Jewish religion. And they made a religion, out of a religion, they made a race, which is just preposterous. And that was reflected in the so-called Nuremberg laws, in which, for example, you were viewed as Jew if you had if you have had some 50% of Jewish ancestry by virtue of religion, adherence to Jewish religion. And those of Jews, there are only one grandparent. And those who have 50%, there are two grandparents. And if these grandparents produced in the father a person who happened to be of Jewish religion, he was viewed as Jewish. And if he was not raised as a Jew, he was viewed as half Jewish and was not sense necessarily. So you have this, and if some person, like for example anyone, happened to turn to the Jewish religion and was persuaded to join Jewish religion, then he was viewed as a full Jew and as a racial Jew. So this is all totally and utterly preposterous. And I myself am kind of a symptomatic sort of person, because according to the Nuremberg laws, I was viewed as a Jew, but I was raised a Christian. But that did not help any, because I had two Jewish grandparents who were Jewish by virtue of the fact that my great-grandparents were converted. Does it make a race? I mean, that's how ridiculous and preposterous the whole thing is, and that's why we have to be very careful to not to perpetuate this nonsense.
Yeah, just my point is simply that that racism is used. I'm not saying that that racism, the idea of superior and inferior races has any validity at all. But the 19th century claimed that. And what we're talking about with the genocide of the Native Americans is particularly the 19th century, that people often believe what they want to believe, particularly if it is to their advantage. And I certainly recognize with John, there's no validity to the idea that people should be unequal to law. I mean, we all should be equal before the law. And in fact, once that starts to slip, once that idea starts to slip, then I think the door is open for taking very drastic action against people who have that you have removed the shield of law from.
Yes.
What you were just saying points up that the Germans, strange to tell, the Nazis were not primarily racist in their persecution of the Jews. They were defining race to suit their own purposes, which seemed to have a deeper motivation than racism, which wasn't there in the beginning. What they were doing, it seems to me, was they were looking for scapegoats in order to exercise their opportunism. They wanted to gain power, and the existence of Jews, who they proceeded then to define as, even though they were only inadequately defined as a religion to begin with, they used the existence of Jews to promote that opportunism so that they could gain more power.
And anti-Semitism, and use the existing anti-Semitism to build upon. Yeah.
Right, but it sort of casts a new light on what we have been content in our ignorance to view as racism on the part of the Nazis, which we equate with the kind of racism that we see happening, say, in the United States against blacks or against Native Americans or against Mexicans.
I think that's a very important point. I like to add one thing which Bob said about the American Indians, that they're viewed here in the United States as inferior race. Ironically enough, the Germans consider them a superior race. And the Indians, even today, are just highly coveted individuals who viewed, Hitler was just an absolute avid reader of Karl May. And Karl May is an author of just novels about American Indians and other novels, but particularly about American Indians, which he made, made him very, he's never been to the United States, But I mean, he wrote exceedingly well written novels, which were very, very stimulating and, if you will, powerful. So even today, and during the Nazi period, American Indians were viewed not at all in just like, for example, blacks or gypsies and all that as inferior race, but as a superior race. And that is the paradox. Yeah.
Dr. Brown, when you describe the American Indians, would it be fair to say that it's a genocide of landowners? Because it happened to the Mexicans in Texas as well as the Indians.
Sure. We're focused on the Native Americans, and it is true that large parts of the United States were a part of Mexico. Texas, the Southwest, California, the state that you're now in. And what you'll find with Manifest Destiny is that the same kind of racial arguments were used to justify the action of Mexican Americans. It's interesting that such arguments didn't come up with the British. There was a conflict over the Oregon Territory. And of course the United States, the famous claim was 54-40 or fight, okay? Which would have carried, if we had the boundary in 54-40, that would be well into British Columbia. Well, obviously what we did, we compromised, because they were people that we understood and to whom we were related and with whom we had much in common. But where it came to people who were repeatedly claimed to be inferior, and that was not only the Native Americans, it was also the Mexican Americans. The dominant culture in the United States had no difficulty using that racism to foster the expropriation of the land.
Can I just add something to that?
Yeah, one of the things that Ed Castillo said last week, and I really abide by that, we're not necessarily here to show whose people suffer the most. And you brought that up about the Mexican Americans in Texas. And there's one event that very few people know about, and we usually have like symbolic events for different peoples. And this is an event that's very close to me because my mother. My mother was born in the United States along with 10 brothers and sisters. And in the 1930s, they were sent back to Mexico, along with 500,000 other Mexican Americans. I just, shudder at the thought that if Mexico had not been next door, what would have happened? But we talk about the Japanese internment, and we talk about the Indian, the massacres, and we talk about the Holocaust, and there's a lot of things that Mexican historians have not come up with, or the books have not been made available to the public. And I thought about including some of the actual, and here we go, the term systematic and intentional and this and that, and the question of race. So I didn't want to get into what is really genocide and what's not really genocide, because I'm more concerned with just human bodies in general. But there was definitely systematic violence against this country, to the extent that the system, the Supreme Justice here in the United States was asked to investigate these patterns of violence against Mexicans. So you're right.
What reason was used for sending all those people back who were born here in this?
The reason was the Depression. They felt that even though they were American citizens, they should go back to, well, not really where they came from, because a lot were actually born here. But the reason was the Depression.
That lady has her hand up for a while.
I'm not sure you want to go along with me, but after these three histories, I'm really looking for an antidote. Would keep talking about how could the Holocaust have happened in such a civilized nation. And when I was there, we kept to this nation as being a very civilized nation. And I'm wondering whether there is such an entity as a civilized nation, or what is the definition of a civilized nation?
Well, we talked about, Horowitz talked about the different categories of what constitutes a genocidal and not a genocidal society. And we have examples where there has been other genocidal, some Scandinavian countries. Not genocidal, none of the Scandinavian countries I can think of, which includes Finland, by the way. And Switzerland certainly could be pointed out as a non-genocidal society. And I'm quite sure we can think of some other ones, but not that many, because many have elements in it where, you know, they are tainted, if you will, tainted with mischief along these lines.
Is there always an economy connected with?
Well, usually it is, because, you know, that the problem is usually the one which will, the situation which will exacerbate any sort of antagonistic feelings, prejudice, stereotyping, and so forth. And so I think it is very closely linked, but not necessarily in all cases. I'm not sure that in the Cambodian situation fits it, although there was a great deal of deprivation and civil war and all that, so which also has, of course, economic ramifications. So I think probably it's very closely linked. The correlation between the economic situation and the political one is of course very high.
I was having a hard time with the notion that there's been reference made to similarities between genocide and imprisoned criminals, and I was wondering if somebody could elaborate. The definition I was referring to with genocide would be the destruction of, like, the innocent people, and I was wondering if somebody could elaborate.
Well, I spoke about imprisonment because I was talking about, at the very beginning I said that my take on this whole question is really what happens to human bodies. And in terms of the process of what happens to human bodies, the large amount of bodies in prison just in this state of California, being more than any other nation, Western nation, I was making that connection in our own behavior as a nation. How is it that we treat human bodies per se? And there's a lot of, I mean, in some cases, if you're a young man, for example, and you end up in prison, your chances of surviving, you might survive maybe physically, but you may not, or you may just be completely destroyed as a human being. So, this whole question about are there any societies that are not genocidal? I think the danger is not just to find a society that's not in all of us to move there. I think that the danger is that we're all as human beings capable of committing these kinds of atrocities, and committing them excuse, whether it's economic or mostly economic. But I think that that's the question for me, and so that's why I made that connection.
Ask Professor Vazquez a question. A concept came up repeatedly in your remarks that I didn't understand, the relation of production of desire.
Yes.
Could you explicate that a little more?
Yeah, I kind of put it to the board in terms of those concepts being there, but I think that a lot of times, we're caught in a prison of concepts. So we talk about, for instance, is it the economy that produces that? Well, there's been a lot of economic situations like Germany's, but you don't have Nazi parties coming out of every single one of them. So the relations of productions of desire, I mean the pursuit of a particular objective to such an extent, with such obsession, that it just becomes a second nature to dehumanize others so that you can reach that objective. And that's what really scares me, is that we are so single-minded as human beings as to what we want, and if we desire something bad enough, we'll get it, and in the process we'll run over other people. I think the manifest destiny could be seen as a plan, for example, as a plan to really decimate anyone on your way, whether they were Mexicans or Native Americans and so forth and so on. So I'm trying to use with that concept a combination of Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, so that it's not just the economy, it's not just the value system, it's not just our libido, but it's a combination. And given the right historical circumstances, people will snap and commit all these kinds of atrocities.
Over here.
Yeah, I can appreciate the three views that each of you have in comparing the genocides that we've been talking about, and saying that no body is worth less or more than another. But I think what we have to look at as the perpetrator in the Nazi Holocaust it seems to me that it stands out because of the perpetrators and their methods and their, it's just different. It's just, when you measure all the factors involved, I mean, one of the reasons why this class is here is because it's the Nazi Holocaust. And I just want to make that clear.
Well, because it was so highly mechanized and technologically advanced, it was possible for them to kill, murder 5 to 6 million people, which makes it a singular event along these lines. But it's not the numbers, as I think we all agree, which makes a genocide. It makes the calculated intent and actual carrying out of this intent a genocide. So the numbers are a catastrophe and make a difference to that particular group of people. But it doesn't necessarily mean, if you don't have that many millions of victims, that this does not constitute a genocide. And also methods, and that is something which we also have to agree, that methods of genocide differ, depending when they started and when they end, and who their target is, or who the target people are.
I think the one difference, or I would like to refer to what you said, and I agree on that point, that you have to arrive at that desire. I heard a quote from one of the Nazi leaders the other day. He said, there are some people who should be decimated. Now, he wasn't just, he was the Slavs, and he was, you know, in general, they honestly believed their desire was that certain people should be decimated. They are not worthy of living.
That's right. I mean, they are viewed, as I said earlier, vermin, as just source of decomposition, parasites, and what have you. Yeah, and that's how they were dehumanized and viewed as such.
You have to develop the desire.
Well, that's a good question. And they certainly had a desire to them. I don't know what their desire was for destroying them, other than prejudice and all the other things which come along with it. And their intent to kill, to destroy. And they really believe it. I mean, I just talked to a number of former perpetrators. They may have changed their mind after the war, to be sure. But during that particular time, they identified with this absolutist ideology, which is utter and undoubted nonsense. And yet that enabled them to do that and also feel not guilty, which I think is the interesting part, because they relegated their conscience to those who gave them the orders and identified with the ideology which was produced and promulgated by the Nazi leaders, Nazi leadership.
I'll just come back to this question of differences in response to this gentleman, that you know, very clearly there are differences between the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust. Just because there are differences doesn't mean that they are not genocides. That in the end, I think the definition of genocide, the intentional mass murder of the men, women, and children of a particular group by a dominant group will stand up. I mean, that's the key, that you want the physical destruction, I think, of a particular group.
I think from everything I'm gathering here in this class, and I take exception to your comment about soldiers going into villages in Vietnam and killing everybody to save them from communism. I think the problem here is on the individual, and the ideologies that are found by governments that we allow to be passed down to mold our own moral concepts about other people's, and then to establish situations where you're placed in a circumstance where you look at that circumstance as a point of individual survival instead of considering what's happening to the other people. If it sounds like what's happened today is that we're comparing all these things, and I'm sorry, but it does sound to me like, well, ours was worse than theirs type thing. And I have a problem with that, in that I don't think any is worse
I mean, we can pick out the reasons, but the blame goes back to the individuals that allow their own moral conscience to be guided by governments that are willing to say, you have to go out and do this, and so you are blindly willing to go out and do that. If we're looking back at blame, I think that's where the blame goes. When we went into villages in Vietnam and fighting started, I can guarantee you that myself or anybody that was with me wasn't fighting to save the people in the village from communism. We were fighting to save our own asses, and that's what it came down to. What happened afterwards was a political and social acceptance of what we did. It was okay because of it. And so we were able to deal with it.
Yeah, if I may just say one, I think we are in disagreement that we have different perspectives perhaps, but I think we don't claim either that one is worse than the other. I don't think you've heard that here.
Well, that's. I'm just saying that's the way I was perceiving it.
No, that's certainly. I don't think
that's happened. This has happened, but ours was.
I don't think that case. I don't think any of us has.
I think that there's a question of, like David mentioned, the Holocaust, and I did listen to the Holocaust lecture, and so the name has a lot to do with it. So the question of definition, I think, is what might have given you that impression. The reason why I use the term that, I mean, that's a famous phrase that was actually recorded in history when they said what happened in that particular village, and the response was, we had to destroy it in order to save it. And that's why I used it to illustrate the extent to which, in a desire to carry on, as you said, a particular duty that has been given to us. I mean, we're trained as soldiers, we're trained to defend our families, we're trained to defend our turf as gang members. So we'll do anything, you know, if I'm a gang member, you get into my turf, you know, it would be, so I was talking about that kind of behavior and not trying to get it out of context.
Can I just add, I mean, you know, clearly in my mind, genocides are comparable. Okay? They're all bad. Because historically, I think the whole idea of genocide, and the main reason I'm interested in it, is that it's such a crushing rejection of the idea that we're all part of a common humanity. That the best way to mark historically that you are a special people is to kill other people because you think they're inferior. And so that, you know, back at the time of the French Revolution, the idea launched was by the French with liberty, equality, fraternity. The idea of a common humanity. And the 19th and the 20th century, it seems to me, have very largely been in opposition against that idea. It's not accidental, I think, that historically, in a cultural way, the German nation tended to reject the Enlightenment.
Well, in the article by, from the diary of Goebbels, he comments that the intent, the goal, the whole goal was to eliminate the Jewish population. Period. That was the intent, and that's what I see differentiates
Well, it was very clear cut
from everything else.
It was very clear cut.
There was no land, there was no crop. They just eliminated it, and that's where I see the difference.
Well, the integral part of the ideology, one, and two, it also enabled them to externalize their conscience.
Gene has not.
Gene, yeah, Gene.
Dr. Brown took us way back to the 19th century, and as a century where genocide was developing, it was a watershed event as far as Jews and Holocaust concerned in the first decade of the 19th century. What happened was, to go back a little further than that, before the French Revolution, Jews were never citizens of the country that they were in. They existed as, the only thing we can think about is some sort of resident alien at the behest of the king or whatever government was there. After the French Revolution, all that was swept away. And Jews were beginning to be invited to become citizens of their respective countries. Now, Napoleon had a problem with that. And what he did, he set out to define who is a Jew. He wanted everybody to be Frenchmen. Or if you're in Germany, be Germans. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, say. And he called together in 1806 a big conclave of Jewish notables from France and all the countries that the French army had conquered, to come together and define the differences. That's the key. Define the differences between the Jews and the dominant culture, which were Christian and national, so that the Jews could learn what not to be and become functioning members of all the different nations. You'll find this in a book called Napoleon, the Great Sanhedrin and the Jews, this library. This was the first time that a state defined the Jews as different. And it's my personal opinion that this was the beginning of the road to Auschwitz. I'd like to hear comments from the panel on that, historically, and maybe Dr. Beard.
I think it's a far stretch from Auschwitz. And I think we should be spending a great deal of time here just...
Well, can I just make a footnote? What you mentioned was the idea of citizenship. Well, the idea of citizenship implies an equality of people living in a society. I would note as a footnote to what Gene said that in fact it wasn't until the Snyder Act of 1924
that Cortez going into the empire of the Aztecs, and it's just from the historical point of view, we identify with Rome on one end, we identify with Cortez because we know the history behind it. But there could be parallels. And it seems like there's this swarming phenomenon going on from Europe, whether it be the Crusades or the sacking of Rome, that seems to repeat itself, and that maybe the times of peace are just respites in that swarming.